Okay, so I'm here with Marten Esko, who is the current creative director of EKKM, but not for long.
Hello.
So, we also talked with you in the interview for the documentary. So, to start off with, I guess we could overlap some topics. So, to begin with, what is this place where we're at? What is this museum, and how it operates?
Well, I think in a way I can't give you too many clear answers. I maybe make things a bit more complicated even than because like the outside look might be more straightforward, but I guess the most intriguing aspect about EKKM is it's kind of like in betweenness or like it not being that well defined what it actually is, or then that it kind of ticks quite many boxes that usually other institutions maybe don't tick, like where they belong or where they are situated.
Mm-hmm. What aspects definitely that it's more than a museum.
In a way, yeah. But then again, maybe it's also less than a museum from some aspects.
Mm-hmm.
But basically, what is certain is that our name is Contemporary Art Museum of Estonia, or then Eesti Kaasaegse Kunstimuuseum, which is basically like a role that is taken, or the kind of the power of naming in a way, that you take a name and then you kind of
the name was available, so you picked it.
Exactly, and then basically what it is, maybe in a most simple way, is that it's an art institution, or it's an art venue, or basically, it's an institution that works in the field of contemporary art that also is a museum.
Mm-hmm.
But as I also mentioned in the previous interview, that basically, in a way, it's simple that to be a museum, you only need a collection, and that kind of was also initiated already in the beginning. So kind of EKKM was established 2006, 2007, and then from 2007 there's already a collection as well. So the first work was acquired in 2007.
And so, that's something I did not know. So you have like a collection of works that, where are they stored?
Basically, currently we are sitting in this temporary collection room. That the next project, that is the first kind of artistic project of next season in 2021 in April, will be like a collection visit, kind of. Basically playing on this kind of established and popular format that basically the most popular like visitors program has usually been this sort of collection visit, or the museum invites people to see their storage and collection and stuff like that. So these are usually flocked by audiences.
To see what they've missed out on over the years.
Exactly. So basically to see the backstages.
Mm-hmm.
And then, basically, we proposed this duo called Rescript, which consists of Marin Mürk and Henry Hütt. They kind of, their platform is based on twisting already established formats of engaging with the audience, or these kind of talks and tours, and so they try to, enhance or twist or kind of short circuit or basically play around with these formats. So they will basically organize this visitation of the collection of EKKM as a sort of performative tour that will basically, I think, take place 10-15 times for a limited amount of people. But as we don't have a storage room, then these works in our collection, and also this kind of like the backstage, will be brought into the actual stage, so the actual exhibition spaces.
Mm-hmm.
So currently we are sitting in this room that we have brought bits and pieces of our collection to kind of see what's the state, and also introduce them to the script and so on. But basically it has always been in the background, the aspect of having a collection.
Mm-hmm.
But this is the only kind of like the only box that needs to be ticked to be like officially a museum.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it's usually in the background, this activity. And as is usual with things that are in the background, we don't have that many, we don't have that much time to focus on them. So the only way to kind of put the collection into focus is to make it part of our main program. So kind of attach it to a project that we are doing, and then we can deal with the collection as well.
Mm-hmm. So in terms of other descriptions of the museum, one definitely sort of, I don't know if it's a catchphrase or a term that's maybe overused sometimes, artist run. And you can definitely see that in the sort of early history, with the 4 original founders who were all essentially artists who needed a space and a workshop and so on. But, now definitely, I don't know, outside of the museum, like, you probably don't go home and paint or do art as your main job. It's maybe more of a side activity, and I assume that's the case with a lot of employees as well. And there's a lot of other museums that you wouldn't call artist-run who have sort of maybe similar people, who also aren't artists but are interested in art. So in the current state, how does that apply, artist-run, in comparison to other museums?
But I think the main difference is that, it's also, of course, like the first interpretation of this term, artist run, that it is a thing that is run by artists. But I guess actually what is more exact, maybe a more precise definition of that term would be that it's actually artistically run in a way, that basically everything that is artist run is also kind of run as an artist practice. So not that an artist who, I don't know, in general does art, but also runs this, but basically decisions that you make while running an institution are made in a similar way that you would maybe make when you're doing an exhibition. So they are...
like a simple example would be that, like money making is not a priority.
Exactly.
And
so it's more
well.
like content oriented, also trying to figure out, I don't know, different ways of doing stuff. So not that maybe also like even at times excessively doubting yourself in a way, but also like being self-critical, self-aware. That's part of like an artist practice usually, that you kind of need to, I don't know, feel your position in society, in now, in a way. And I guess that should extend to an institution that is kind of like artist run. But then again, I guess I wouldn't say that we are now artist run, but this is also something that can be used to describe us. Because in a way, like kind of like an official statement is that we're somewhere between artist run and official institutions. So these are like the perimeters of where we situate, but we haven't defined the place where we're at. So it also kind of moves around in this, I don't know, it's not even like an X and Y graph, but has maybe more points where it tilts towards to. So currently, now we're kind of tilting more towards being a museum because of the upcoming project, but at times we are like tilting more towards being just an art gallery, or then I don't know, a club, or well, we can use these different roles that basically position in between those terms that we use to describe us.
Well, I think another aspect to that term is that maybe you prioritize artists. That for you, the audience, of course, they're important, but they're not the priority. You're not thinking that much. What are they gonna think? You're thinking, how do we provide the artists the best opportunities to sort of, express their vision. But so maybe then in comparison to other museums or art institutions, what do you think is the focus there if it's not that much artist-centric? Is it, for the audience? Is it for art collectors, which would probably be the case for galleries? So,
I mean, well, thankfully it's more like institution-specific than like a category-specific thing. But in general, well, first off, museums definitely, at least here, focus more on the audience because they also rely on the income of ticket sales and so on. Then there's also the research aspect, which is part to do with the museum's obligation to preserve their collection for eternity in a way. That basically a museum is still a place of knowledge making in a way. Then there's also the educational aspect of growing new audiences, kids programs and so on. And I guess in a way the most crucial aspect is this kind of preservation for eternity. And I mean, like especially nowadays when like eternity doesn't seem that long anymore because the end of the world kind of seems closer. So I mean that's kind of the paradox that is also it basically is present regardless of the situation. But from our perspective, I mean, like from our collection perspective as well, we don't have this kind of preservation for eternity in mind, and I don't think it ever has been. And I guess it's also been more of like a superficial, not actually superficial, but representational thing of having a collection. Then that most of the collection is also conceptual, so we don't kind of have works that are kind of unique objects that we preserve in boxes and so on. But
well, of course, if you have like an exhibition that takes up the whole museum space, and you have multiple exhibitions, you need multiple museums to store them.
Exactly. And another aspect is, of course, a permanent display as well that we don't have. We have some works put up around the building, but the main difference between us and a usual contemporary art museum would be this, that we are not writing and rewriting history, because that's also what museums do. That they kind of write the history of their field in a way. Art museums write the history of art in a way, and they also present it in a space. But in a way, that's also a more wider question of a function of a museum, because in the art field, museums do function differently than in other fields. Because in the art context, museums are still places where you also have like new works. You see new art in that sense. That's you don't go to a literary museum to find new books, but then again, for example, in Kumu, you have the 5th floor for new exhibitions. You see what's new happening in art, and then you also have the permanent display that goes into history. But
as well, like some national museums would also have that, like a permanent display, and
then you have the like changing exhibitions where you still kind of show the latest things happening, or then you also, I don't know. So from that aspect, the museum's role in art context is different than in most other places. But then again, also a museum is something that kind of is the only art institution, not actually only art institution, but at least in Estonia, where there are fewer institutions, that's the main employer of the sector in a sense, except for the artists. But that's another story. But basically, I would say Estonian Art Museum is the biggest employer in the art sector. And then now that the Tallinn Art Hall is also a governmental institution, now there's like a first governmental art institution that is not a museum, that focuses on new art.
How does that institution work? It's called Tallinn Art Hall?
So basically that's like a sort of Kunsthalle format, which is literary art hall, but it comes from a kind of a German tradition of having basically a hall for art that doesn't show you history, but can also show you history, but focuses on the present in that sense. That gives you, I don't know, curated shows and stuff like that, because the role of curator has come like in the second half of the 20th century. Basically, that's more associated with the art hall model now. But historically, a curator has been like a caretaker, because that's basically what the word means. That historically they were part of museums, and they were the people responsible for taking care of the collections. So basically, a caretaker of the artworks in the collections.
So historically, they'd be more like art historians who need that approach, and now it's more like, you know, people who can find the new things.
Because the role of the independent curator came from 60s, 70s onwards, and before that it was all institutional in that sense, and then that was more associated with the museums.
And so from what you were just talking about, you know, having this permanent collection and ticking off the boxes that would make you more of a museum, I think that's a very sort of important stage that you're going through right now, is, you know, scaling from, I don't know if the word becoming more serious would be proper, but, you know, scaling up this sort of artist-run system. And I think that's one thing that stands out about EKKM, is that you've come this far. You know, there's a lot of artist-run museums, you know, small galleries with their community, but they usually don't go that far. They might last long, but, you know, they have a small audience, and they probably don't have the name, you know, Country Contemporary Art Museum. So if we look at bigger contemporary art museums in other countries, you know, say Tate in England, or Pompidou, and so on, how scalable do you think this sort of approach is? Could you have an institution that's, you know, close to the size of something like the Pompidou Center that still retains the values that you have? Or when you get to that level, it becomes impossible, you know, with the money involved and so on.
Yeah, I think it will definitely become impossible. Just for the pure size of the collective, I guess, as well. Hundreds of people on payroll, you have the structure of hierarchy, a lot of money involved. Because I mean, currently here it's also more of like almost like a non-hierarchical kind of situation, that we do have like in that sense like official names, as I'm kind of like a, I don't know, even like a CEO, if to like robustly translate it, but basically more of like a managing director. But then again, I mean, there's another managing director as well, who is Johannes, and then there's a curator project manager and a creative producer, and that's all of us. That's the four of us in that sense. But I mean, like, the obligations are kind of divided between us.
And I guess sort of vague as well, that, you know, you pick up.
I mean, who is available to do that, does that. And then also the question of, you know, like kind of pay, the size of pay that we try to keep equal on all positions in that sense. But that basically varies from, you know, if you're full-time or you're part-time. So, but the one full position, it has in that sense so far been equal among people who work here.
Well, yeah, I think thinking about scaling to that size, it becomes quite political even. You know, when you look at the beginnings of this sort of, also a term that, you know, you could use to describe this place, you know, punk, as it started out as a squat, and you could compare scaling up, you know, how do you go from, say, a workers run cafe to, you know, having a Starbucks that would be workers run, you know. In the current system, it's basically impossible. So that applies to the museum as well.
But then again, also like museums in general historically have been basically, you know, still symbols of power in that sense. That, for example, if you look at the British Museum, which is basically a collection of stolen artifacts from other countries that they have colonized. And then historically also art museums that, you know, people weren't allowed into. I guess that change came, I don't know if I remember correctly, but from the 19th century, I guess, basically with, you know, workers having free time and so on, but also making the collections public. Because historically they have all been just, you know, people on power having art and then keeping it for themselves, and now this has changed. But then
so
again,
like portrait painting was, you know, essentially kings want to have their portraits.
Yeah, but in any case, like the art sector itself has changed a lot, and I mean, well, it's not my own opinion, but it's something that I kind of agree with, is that we are Yeah. Okay. Where to start again? Basically, well, yeah, it's kind of my opinion, so I'm not vouching it to be 100% sure. It's all doubtable, but basically, in that sense, modernism as a process in the art, for me at least, has kind of ended already a long time ago. But then again, it is still kind of continuing. But but where we are now is kind of more called like the contemporary art or contemporaneity, which isn't that well also defined. But the problem is also that it uses a word that's already been in use for a while. But the difference is that basically quite many people define contemporary art as not only artworks that are contemporary, but kind of the entire system of the infrastructure of art. So also all the positions that people can hold, artists, curators, I don't know, museum directors, gallery directors, so on, and then all this structure of institutions, as well as kind of like networks of exchange and so on. So all this is actually contemporary art. So we've also had this question of, if we are a contemporary art museum, and as well, if we kind of look additions to our collection, then usually like this kind of usual art museums, they have a more tactical approach to it, because they need to kind of pick out things that they will later on be writing history with, that the thing should kind of still represent the time that they were picked out from. Mm-hmm. But our collection is a very eclectic one, because basically there's been works that have been donated, works that we have had transactions with the artists, but we've never had a budget to buy works, so we don't acquire works in this usual mode. So then the question is that what do we collect? Do we only collect artworks? But I don't think we have so far, because we do have artworks, but what are more important quite often are the stories, how they came to be, or like or this kind of symbolic transaction that was made. I don't know, well, for example, the first work was acquired for 1 krone that was found in the yard of the next building, and I mean, mm-hmm. 1 krone is €1 divided by 15. So yeah, and another work was just acquired by the symbolic transaction of inviting the artist to have an exhibition here, and then we got the work, and so on and so on. So currently we're also thinking of if EKKM would have a strategy of collecting artworks, then what could it be? And could we also start collecting things that are so far being considered like uncollectible? Like, could we maybe collect an exhibition, or could we collect another institution? Or this kind of interesting but also blown up questions that mm-hmm. basically if we would have another artist run space, for example in Tallinn, that kind of is almost stopping functioning because people have burnt out or so on, that could we acquire this idea of that artist run space to our collection? Mm-hmm. It would be interesting. So yeah, these are kind of the questions that we're considering now, and I guess this is the aspect of also inquiring what is the role of a contemporary art museum now, but also in the future, because I don't see a big future for huge institutions, because kind of the capitalist logic of constant progression and expansion doesn't seem to be leading to the place we should be going to. So I guess these smaller scale initiatives actually, well, first they are also cheaper to be maintained, but also maybe, I don't know, give out more interesting output. But that doesn't mean that the current big national ones should be replaced by them. But I mean, we shouldn't just build more of those. And I don't think EKKM's dream has ever been to become a very large institution and just grow and expand and capitalize on the thing.
And so I guess there's two interesting aspects from what you just talked about is one that I guess sort of scaling to be a bigger museum is not impossible just because sort of there's obstacles to it, but it would be sort of contrary to your vision, that you would maybe rather have then more museums like this appear rather than you taking up all the space. And the second one is that I had never really thought about how contemporary art just not means, sort of the genre or style of contemporary art, but also, the system in which it's produced.
It's even more, I would say, like it's a condition that the art is in currently, because basically, the main difference is that there's no longer this sort of underlying narrative or like an underlying logic of progression that modernism had. That basically modernism was kind of a process of freeing art from its kind of limitations. So, I mean, most simply put, basically just trying out new things that haven't been done before, but that doesn't happen anymore.
Yeah, that's something I definitely think about a lot, is that, what separates modern art and contemporary art for me is that, in modern art, these artists would sort of be doing things that, people would look at and be shocked, think, oh, how is this art? The most famous one probably, the urinal and so on. And that contemporary art is now in this space where it's like, all that's been done, our perceptions of art, whatever, we're open to everything. And now you operate in that framework that, whatever I do and create, can be artistic. And I also feel like a lot of, I don't want to be too mean, but maybe a lot of artists are still stuck in this sort of space where they're trying to be shocking, Like there was not that recently, scandal about, the artwork that was a banana taped to a wall. And there it also already feels like, it's not that genuine, that it's, this sort of spectacle to just rile up the people who still aren't there, to go like, oh, that's not art.
Yeah. No, but yeah, it's become, in a way, it has become also more aware of itself because of basically information technology. And I mean, like, in a way, the world is synchronized now. That's also this another easy differentiation between modernism and contemporaneity is this sort of logic of time as well. That in modernism, time was like a linear progression, and some countries were ahead of other countries in time. Kind of that was, I guess, like a simplistic attitude that the US is in front, and some other third world countries will be there in 20 years or something like that. But
like progress versus barbarism. There's exactly. That famous caricature.
Yeah, but now, I mean, it's obvious that there's not this sort of being behind time logic anymore. That we are all in this present together, and we just have different situations going on. And I mean, this has also now, like in hindsight, at least during the 20th century, there was talk of basically a single modernism, that it was like a singular global kind of progression. But now, with this idea of contemporaneity has also come the idea of different modernisms. That simply put, modernism is basically the cultural output of modernity, or in that sense, modernity coming from the technological revolution and so on. So modernism is a cultural output of that. And now we've understood that basically they varied a lot in different nations. And also Soviet Union had its own modernism, even though the word was banned in the Soviet Union, basically. And basically, all different small local modernisms took place in the 19th century, 20th century. So the understanding of that has also changed, I mean, how the art world sees itself as well. And also this kind of myth of the male genius and so on. So also rewriting of history and rewriting of all this colonial histories and so on has been basically what has been happening a lot in the art for a while. And that's also been kind of the role of the museum to not actually to initiate that, because museums are very hard to change, but basically now we can see that these things have started to change, at least, also with the bigger museums.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and another aspect to that is that, well, besides the people who would simply look at contemporary art and say, what is this? This isn't art, this takes no skill. There's people who may have more sophisticated criticisms, like about, how a lot of this sort of very expensive art and this upper art world is used for money laundering and so on, and that it operates in this sort of, very rich people's world, and it's not relevant to people who can't afford to be in it. And I think that this museum also gives a very good counter argument to that you can still make contemporary art that's, completely out of this framework, of these collectors and so on.
I mean, it's actually not out, because in a way also the artists that we've shown in this exhibition here are quite often part of bigger galleries and also make a lot of money from selling their works through these galleries. But I mean, it's also I think a question of how you kind of serve it or present it as well, that we are not presenting it as something, as an expensive artifact, or building logic around that, which is usually maybe how contemporary art galleries present solo exhibitions there, that they try to still put some content to the show, but it is still quite heavily, a product display as well at the same time, in the same logic as a product display.
Yeah, so you can go there and you can sort of take the work home. But here it would be sort of less possible, since more, the exhibition has this theme and it's all interconnected, and outside of it, it wouldn't, work as well.
But like basically the art market has definitely had a huge impact on what contemporary art is and how people see it. And that's also one thing with capitalism, that it kind of, very easily takes everything or incorporates everything very easily. Even like the most fierce criticism of capitalism can be easily incorporated into capitalism to make money. So basically this also has happened to a very large part of contemporary art in that sense. But this is something
like a good example would be Banksy, who's sort of this anti-corporate thing, but has become very much commercialized in a lot of ways.
But there's also like instances of, basically there's the primary market, and then there's the secondary market for art. And primary market is something that's, but basically that's kind of like the first purchase in that sense, that where the art actually comes from the artist. But I think, well, I'm not a market specialist as well, but it should be that actually the secondary market is way bigger in volume. That is basically transactions between collectors. So this is where the biggest millions are made in that sense. That it doesn't.
Like Rothko never really made the millions that his work sold for.
Yeah, he just killed himself out of desperation. So yeah. So this is also like kind of a big shadow over the art world in that sense as well. But this is also where these free ports and money laundering comes into play as well.
Yeah, well, just watch Tenet, also relevant to Estonia, but there's the free port and everything.
Exactly. And funnily enough, the free port is actually Kumu Art Museum.
Oh, okay. I did not know that.
They filmed it there.
Okay. Haven't been to that museum yet, so that's on the list. I got lost a little bit there. What I wanted to ask about, so, contemporary art, very vague, hard to define, but is there sort of a characteristic of the contemporary art that's displayed here? Are there any qualities or ways that you could describe, what is the sort of EKKM brand of contemporary art?
I guess, like, first and foremost, maybe that it should still have some sort of social relevance. Because that's still some kind of even though art shouldn't have a function, I think it kind of still should, especially if, just looking at the wider context of how the world is going and so on, then, anyway we need to scale down on things, and then things that don't have a function maybe, aren't that easily seen as necessary. So we kind of try to avoid also this sort of art for art's sake kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
This is not like a clear red line that, these things go on that side and these go on the other side, but basically still that even if the artworks themselves, like individually, are not that directly linked to a social issue or just an everyday issue or something that people can relate to, then at least the focus of the exhibition should kind of highlight some aspect of the artwork that is related to our present in that sense. Mm-hmm. So this is something that we try to keep in mind constantly if we're looking at what to do. But otherwise, I guess it's also down to our possibilities as well. That we can't have every kind of artworks here. But yeah, I guess the content oriented approach is maybe the main thing.
Mm-hmm. So maybe now a little bit less about contemporary art and all of that. Maybe we can return if there's something more to say. I think something that we didn't really get to that much that I wanted to explore about this museum, and when we talked about it in the interview, is this whole community aspect. Mm-hmm. Besides the artists, besides the people that work here, it's the people that come here who are usually young people. Mm-hmm. And maybe it's a little bit less relevant now, definitely more when you had the parties. Mm-hmm. And it's definitely sort of this community center for young people mm-hmm. to meet each other, find people with similar interests, have something to do in their free time, which I feel like for a lot of people is really lacking, especially since we've talked, about capitalism and all mm-hmm. of that. If you're a young person who doesn't really have a job or, you don't earn a lot of money, mm-hmm. there's not a lot of places you can go and do stuff without spending money. Mm-hmm. You can go to a cafe, you need to buy a coffee. And I feel like this museum fills that role for a lot of people, that this is where they come so. To.
But yeah, I guess the main issue here as well is like our kind of small, like the scale of our staff as well. That we have that in mind that you just said, but we're not actively dealing with that or actively, kind of working on that end. But then again, we have still worked quite a lot to just have this or provide this setting, because that's also one of the key points to why we don't have a ticket, to keep it still part of like free public space as well. That you can come to an exhibition several times if you're interested, or then just kind of hang around, look at the first floor, then hang around in the yard, so on. So kind of make it possible for people to have options mm-hmm. of using this place as well, because maybe that's also kind of like conceptual or as well ideological, but I don't think any of us as well thinks that EKKM is their own thing. That maybe that's also what separates us and places us more towards the public sphere, even though we legally are more of like a private museum, basically. But I guess that's also where the kind of third sector comes to play, that we are kind of a non-profit private thing. Mm-hmm. But basically that it's not the private thing. So it's meant for anyone who wants to kind of use it. And that's also something that's part of this initial mission statement, that the EKKM is kind of like a tool. So this is also something I kind of like to think, that EKKM can be used as a tool also for specific ends.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you said that it's not something that you focus on, because mm-hmm. certainly it's something that takes energy and would mm-hmm. take away from your being able to focus on being a museum mm-hmm. and providing for the artist. It's almost like this sort of responsibility is thrown on you, and mm-hmm. giving these young people a community that it's hard to find somewhere mm-hmm. else.
Mm-hmm. So I wouldn't say we're like community managers, but maybe we're community providers. I don't mm-hmm. know, something like that. That basically, like, I know that there's also like some like basically like I don't remember the word at the moment, but I know there's some like groups of people that routinely come here that I think I have never had any interactions with, for example, or that the community around EKKM is not actually that kind of a whole or intertwined thing, but more of like separate groups of people. And I guess
it's more like a space, where people can come and have their own little communities inside.
And I guess there's, and also like coming from the fact that we haven't defined ourselves very clearly, this also kind of leaves a lot of room for imagination in that sense. And I guess there's a lot of different EKKMs around, like from the perspective of the audience, that what EKKM is for them, for example. So that's where these different roles kind of come to play. But then again, we try to, from the backstage, try to manage these different roles as well.
Yeah, well, like if you think of a mall, where teenagers go to hang out, there's people who have mall for them is, where they buy things. Mall for these teenagers is just a place to hang around.
Exactly.
And perhaps there's a lot of people who have this similar approach to here. They just come here when they want to do something and they're not that interested in art itself.
And I guess the small aspect is very relevant in the Tallinn context, or as well in Estonia, which is I guess one of the has basically, I don't know if the most, but is in the top of the list of commercial spaces per capita. And that's also an issue of like Nordic countries as well. That I mean, like in southern Europe, for example, you have public space, you have free gathering space, but for example, for us, where like half of the year is kind of cold to sit outside, it's dark as well, and the only free public space that we have is basically commercial space. That is these kind of malls and places where you can go, but you still kind of need to buy something. Malls have also taken away their
or if you don't, you feel guilty for not doing it.
Exactly. Or then someone comes and says, "Oh, you can't just go and sit in a cafe and have your own water bottle or something like that." And I think malls have also now taken away all these seats and stuff like that. So loitering is not prohibited.
Yeah. 2 years ago, probably now Riboka, the Riga International Biennale of Contemporary Art. I worked as a guide there, and it was a venue that was in a train station in my hometown. And there was this first floor with a lot of these sort of works, and then there was a second floor which used to be a cafe in the Soviet times. And then the artist, one of the artists, he sort of transformed this room in his vision as a mix between a temple and a club. So it had, it was all orange windows, and it had this ambient music playing in the background, and the whole floor and part of the walls are carpeted, and there's pillows to sit on. And all I could think about every time I was there, it was how nice it would be if this was permanent. If I went to this train station, I have a train in an hour, I would have this place where I could go just sit on my phone, computer, read a book. But of course, when the Riboka ended, it's all taken down, and now it's this. Now there's art there, so it still has a function. But it'd be nice if there were more places like this, more spaces like this.
Yeah, that's also something I kind of feel personally as well. At least like from my own perspective, things I enjoy the most are kind of these like spatial situations that exhibitions create. Because, at least for me, these semi-clinical, like gallery or museum spaces are kind of, especially if you work in the field, they become boring or repetitive, and
they're not cozy, they're not homely. You sort of go there, you do what you want, and you want to leave.
They don't surprise. They are, what you expect, and you maybe you get what you expect, but usually you get a bit less even. So these kind of like twists of reality are, I think, they have more effect. So not just pictures on the wall, but of course depends on the pictures, but kind of more of like an atmosphere that actually has thought of the audience that is in it. But yeah, with like institutions, there's the issue of having a program and having variety and so. But weirdly enough, yeah, we don't have that many more permanent artworks around, because for example in New York or like in bigger cities you have these almost permanent installations, especially from like late modernism, where you had this.
So something like the Wall Street Bowl,
for example, or you have I don't remember whose work that was now, like a room filled with oil somewhere, or then had some apartment exhibitions that some foundation has bought the apartment now and then the exhibition is there permanently, or some more like a huge installation has been kept and maintained so far, or something like that. But there's something I feel there's the lack of something that EKKM initially was as well, that maybe comes out of several reasons. Because usually, for example, one key aspect that is there in almost all artist-run spaces is that they were initiated out of a need, or out of a need to cover some sort of a lack, that a certain generation of artists didn't have spaces to exhibit or something like that. But I guess maybe there's not enough of a need at the moment. But I think there is.
Well, I think the problem there is that creating spaces like that is not profitable at all, and that it takes a lot of dedication.
Yeah, it needs need.
Yeah, and for example, for artists, creating this museum, they needed that space for themselves. But to create this sort of space where people can go and not have to pay and just be in, whose responsibility would it fall on? Is it the government that should do it? And it becomes very complicated. Who would then sort of design it and so on? And government isn't great in doing these creative things.
I mean, there's the difference between this sort of grassroots initiative and top-down initiatives. That I guess these things basically blossom when the people who came with the idea are the ones who are actually doing it as well, and not that someone basically made this sort of a 10-year plan how the cultural sector should develop from the ministry's perspective, and now we're trying to fill in what was written in that paper, and then we have to have this and we have to have that and so on. Because in that perspective also a good comparison is our neighbor Kultuurikatel, which is also like a cultural institution by definition. But then again, they haven't really given that much to culture. I mean, there's not that many remarkable or memorable cultural things that have happened there. But then again, when you then compare like the cost of upkeep, that we have different funders, they are from the city, but just numerically it's not 10 times but tens of times different. That's what the cost of upkeep for us is and what theirs is. But that's also that they are positioned in a logic, into a kind of a capitalist logic of culture industry that basically is an industry that is reliant on their income from the artist, and that kind of is a stupid idea that artists aren't people who have money that is left over, or excess amount of money that an industry could rely on. Because in a way, simplistic idea is to rent out studios for artists, and then artists pay, and then the institution gets funding, and then it functions. But it should be the other way around in a way.
So what do you think is the best way that either the government or private individuals could try to support these sort of spaces? So yeah, as we just talked about, the government deciding, or we're gonna build this communal space is probably not gonna work out because it needs to happen organically.
In a way, yeah, there should be people who want to run it, and there should be a community that actually needs it. So yeah, but from that perspective, I guess, and especially if the rich pay taxes, then I mean it would be only logical that culture is something that is supported by taxes, because currently, I think the Estonian system in that sense works well, but I guess the lack of private funding comes also from the lack of this kind of old money, that fortunes that were made a long time ago, and now they have heirs who kind of spread it around. But we have more like newly rich people who kind of have just gained the money, and it's their own. So it's it's not inherited, or it just isn't around, but they feel entitlement for it, and therefore don't really kind of just give it away.
Yeah, I think that's one thing, that a lot of these people who have inherited wealth or come from these families, they're keen on creating these institutions, perhaps with their names on them. But a lot of people who are newer money, for them, well, I can buy 10 Teslas. And
Exactly. Yeah, or a huge screen or a boat. Yeah, but then again, for example, what's the difference again between entertainment and art, kind of, which I think is basically also becoming more vague, and art is being pressured into being more like entertainment, or then, okay, not art but culture in general, that basically well, the market works on the basis of the what's the word now, basically the need, the demand, exactly. But culture shouldn't. I mean, you shouldn't consider that much what the audience wants to see, but more of actually what the the cultural creation should be. Or
I guess another way to put it would be that people don't know what they want.
Exactly.
A lot of art that we appreciate now, then no one would have thought, oh, I want surrealism.
Because well, that's also just this kind of, and yeah, and then to come back to this private or public funding question, then with private funding usually comes also a sort of demand on what the output should be as well, and also from the public funding aspect, I think this sort of relation to using taxpayer money and so on, it shouldn't be thought as such, I guess, that the taxpayer shouldn't demand on what the culture should be, but the culture should be kind of in a way left alone as well, from this sort of demand on what it should be, but more of trying to kind of understand why it is at all, because I mean, culture is a kind of interesting phenomenon, that it is opposed to this sort of market production logics and logic of profit, and just also logic of having something practical as well, because entertainment is kind of still practical, it entertains, but art shouldn't.
So returning to this, combining these ideas that this is sort of an artist run or artist prioritizing space, and these communal spaces, do you think there are other sectors maybe outside of culture where this same model can work? Sort of an EKKM that's not an art museum, that's, I don't know, I don't want to say bar because that's the first thing that comes to my mind, but do you think there are people in other industries, what they could take away and sort of implement
I think
themselves?
definitely. I mean, that's the phenomenon of artist run, in a sense, that I think everything can be artist run in that sense. That I mean, we have even like a artist run car repair workshop behind Kristiina Keskus that an artist is running. That is maybe, but then again, I think a government as artist run could also be maybe temporarily interesting, but basically, I guess it comes down to some sort of like values and how you see things in general, because that's also maybe something that's different from a usual kind of work situation that I guess very few artists see their work as, you know, just work that I do, even though that's also a very usual comment on, you know, this is just the work I do. I don't know how to do anything else, so I make art.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess in reality, no one does that from 9 to 5, you know, and then has kind of like an outside of work identity or this kind of stuff. So it's more of like a way of living, but especially, you know, when to see it from society's perspective, then work is also moving that towards that side, that, you know, the differentiation between work and free time and also your kind of your identity is very often intertwined with what's your job. So it's easier to separate it from 9 to 5, but I don't think artists kind of should do that. Mm-hmm. Anyway, and usually they don't. And for example, from my own perspective, I haven't seen my work here or my job here as running EKKM as a job, but it has kind of been the way I live for the past, mainly for the past 5 years, but basically still for the past 10 years. So mm-hmm. It's also, yeah.
I think there's sort of maybe a paradox or a double-edged sword where this sort of idea that, you know, my work is not me, mm-hmm. that creates this sort of alienation where, you know, when you're there, you're thinking, I'm just doing this for money. This mm-hmm. has no other purpose. Mm-hmm. And, you know, that, of course, makes you feel like your life is maybe less meaningful. But then on the other side, this dissolving this work-life balance mm-hmm. also has a lot of negatives, you know, especially if you have people above you, you know, who mm-hmm. now expect you that when you go home, you're still thinking about work. Mm-hmm. And, you know, you're not getting paid for that. So another thing that I wanted to talk about is this this party scene and all of that, which is also, you know, a part of this whole community thing. How necessary do you think that existing is to art? You know, looking historically, a lot of art movements, they had, you know, this maybe sort of space, cafe or bar where, you know, these all artists congregated, had their bohemian lifestyles, and that, you know, inspired their art. Do you think that is also the same phenomenon that's happening sort of here?
I think I think it is crucial, and I'm not sure if it's a term, but we've also used it here around, that it's kind of like it provides a situation where you are kind of in brackets. And these are usually very fruitful situations for generating strange new ideas and just, you know, talking things through as well, because mm-hmm. it's even though it's EKKM has also functioned as a club, at the same time, I mean, it was also like, you know, a conversation festival or something like that as well, because you had dancing, sort of like a dance stage as well, but then many people still sat around and spoke endlessly. Mm-hmm. And I think that's very crucial, especially for this sort of smaller scale initiatives, that you know, you have to kind of come up with good solutions and sort of unexpected solutions for situations, because just working how other institutions work doesn't work that well in that sense. That's, you know, we also don't, we have kind of positions here, but we still are employed more as people than as, you know, as roles. Mm-hmm. That is more.
You're not the CEO of EKKM, you're the Marten of EKKM.
Exactly. So Johannes is Johannes, and Laura is Laura, and Evelyn is Evelyn. So mm-hmm. this is also something that's more different with the bigger institutions, that we don't actually have a structure, because in a way, if we would have a structure, that would mean that, you know, one person is kind of like 3 departments, and you can't expect that from a person. So you need to adapt to the situation as well. But also having this sort of party environments, this is the place also where you very easily meet a lot of new people as well. And I mean, this you don't do in having scheduled meetings. I would want to meet you. Could we meet tomorrow next week at 2 a.m. or not 2 a.m. but 2 p.m. or just have a meeting for meeting new people. It's not a thing. And historically as well. I mean, I guess most culture sector I would say it, like most cultural most bigger cultural waves have come with like a bigger party scene as well. For some personal quirk, I've kind of been interested in this sort of late 80s, 90s UK music scene, for example, and then there's that was basically the kind of like a rise of indie labels and so on. It's also something that kind of grew out of grassroots initiatives, but like reading a lot of interviews from that, there's almost no interview that doesn't mention that most deals or most ideas came from clubs or parties, or meeting people at parties and having a conversation, because that's also when your guard is down. That's this kind of like a being in this sort of brackets, that this isn't a daytime kind of atmosphere, and this isn't also you're not sleeping as well, so it's somewhere in between. And
well, it definitely breaks barriers that when you go to this sort of rave or party and you go outside and there's a random stranger, any other day of the week you saw them on the street, you wouldn't even say hi to them, but there they might be a stranger and you'll start talking for hours.
Yeah, and I mean it's in a way similarly unpractical, it's in a way, I mean, the practicality of it is that it kind of is emotionally relaxing, and you can let yourself go in parties, but that's kind of like the only function of it. Otherwise it's more of like time we have taken for ourselves to kind of enjoy, and then these conversations that take place during that time are you usually have time then to talk as well. And also now to make a reference to the contemporary art scene, I mean, the young British art scene of the 90s also basically came on the same wave. So we initiated with independent exhibitions in post-industrial warehouses, and then having parties as well during the openings and so on. So this sort of work was done during the night mainly. But that doesn't mean that this actually still functions here daily, but I mean this has been a good addition to it, and as well, like jokingly say that it's been part of our public program in that sense. This is engaging new audiences and so on.
I think very relevant to that is we talked with Kevin, and I mean his role was this sort of creating these events, and what I thought was very interesting from his side that all of the parties that he sort of organized, they had to have a purpose and have a theme, and you wouldn't make one just to go there and drink and dance. That it all had this sort of something along with it. And now that I thought over it, it's very much, I think, linked together with the idea of exhibitions, and that this sort of party is an exhibition, and you go there and you sort of become a performance artist in a sense. You take this role of whatever the theme is, and sort of step outside of yourself a little bit and become a part of this bigger thing, of this exhibition of people. And
also from that perspective, to talk about what future progressions can be predicted in the art context. Well, something that has definitely already for a while been happening is this sort of overlapping of the theater and the art field, or this notion of performance as well, but also even more things being more event based, that you also have a purpose for being being there at that time, because I feel that this is also something that has happened more and more as the time goes on. But basically, just having an exhibition open and then making people themselves have to kind of decide or come up with when they will go and see the exhibition, and then you're usually the only one there if you don't have a friend with you, and then this isn't that attractive anymore. And not that things should only be attractive, but this is something that needs to be considered. And I guess this sort of like a nightclub, theater and an exhibition venue is a sort of like a trio model that is very functional. At least this is something that I see still very functional in the future as well.
I think that connects with what you said, that contemporary art has become more aware of itself, and I think a part of that is that it has become more aware of the audience. And you said theater, and like why it feels completely off watching theater on the television is that you being there and other people being present is a huge aspect of that theater performance.
Exactly. And the theater also, especially in this post-Soviet context that we are in, that the theater was kind of the main cultural form, and at least in Estonia also theater is the dominant field in the culture. Maybe film also has similar budgets, but they're completely incomparable to what art has. This is also like our sort of like the cultural audience in a more general context is a large part of it is the theater audience, or people who are used to the sort of theater going and going to an event. So from that perspective, like the exhibition context and people who go to museums or galleries act differently as well, because they are used to just finding their own time and then going. But having events, that's also why institutions have more and more the sort of tours, and a tour with the artist, a tour with the curator. One exhibition maybe has loads of those, just to have this sort of side program that kind of invites people over, that now there's something happening. So just an exhibition being open is no longer just enough, it's not an event by itself. So it should have
It needs to be kind of a spectacle.
Yeah, exactly.
Because
in the end you're competing with Netflix, basically.
What you mentioned about specifically like post-Soviet countries, it's very interesting. Also in Latvia, I think like theater is one of, I don't know what's the right word for it, would be like most advanced form of culture that we have, where it's like, I look at Latvian theater and I can say, I feel like this is good. And in comparison to other countries where art might be better, let's say that, but I feel like that's something strong. And maybe that's a topic for another discussion. Why is it specifically these sort of post-Soviet countries, specifically Baltic countries, why is theater so important there? So I guess, maybe the last thing that I'd like to talk about is, I remember it also in the interview when we talked about sort of who are the artists that exhibit here, that a lot of these artists are international artists, and a part of that is that it's easier to get funding for that as well, from these sort of either EU programs and so on. And of course there's benefits to that, but I also feel like to me there's something missing there. When you can go to an exhibition in whatever country and there will always be these international artists, and it's all sort of the same and very similar. And maybe there's lacking some sort of national identity. And
kind of, but I think it is never there as well, because now that we spoke of theater, then in comparison, for example, theater is very kind of like not a national, but still like a local thing, because it's also very language based, and then again it's difficult to place into various different contexts, because it needs a workaround or reworking of the piece, or then you have to interpret the entire translate the entire thing into another language and so on.
And yeah, also a lot of the most like, sort of famous theater plays I can think of in Latvia, you know, they're very linked to Latvian culture. You know, it might be about sort of celebrating summer solstice, or it's about, you know, a folklore hero or something like that.
But I mean, the biggest ones, for example, in Estonia, they've been very international as well, that they've managed to be, then again, that means in English basically, because that's the kind of international language. But for example, if you look at another theater that's more close to the contemporary art sector, that's Konoti-Gildi-Saal, that has more of a focus even on dance and then performance and this like mixed genre things, then I like that usually they have this in the description of the event, they have this the duration, blah blah, and then language, and usually the behind that is no problem, that, you know, there's no spoken word, so the language isn't a problem. And with and that I think is what also you know, links to contemporary art in that sense, that with most art, language isn't an issue, and from that perspective as well, that we've spoken about like the world being synchronized and everything, you know, you can easily, you know, get information of what's happening on the other side of the world at the same time. That the art as contemporary art, that is an international thing, so that's also like an international language. Then you maybe can see some sort of national, or then I think nation bears only relevance to as it structures like a locality, or, you know, it structures geography and language, but basically you can see maybe local peculiarities, but I don't think you can really honestly speak about like Estonian contemporary art as something specifically different than Latvian contemporary art, or it's just, you know, a frame that you put onto the art. Because that's also maybe difference between these two terms, contemporary art and art now, for example, which in Estonian are usually like used as synonyms, which is kaasaegne kunst and nüüdiskunst. But basically the difference between them is that this art now, what it uses to you know, frame out what it basically defines, it uses the word now, so it puts like a temporal condition onto art. So it defines the art that it defines by when the art was made. But contemporary art, that doesn't mean that, or that doesn't, you know, put this sort of like a time separations to the artworks. And I guess similar separation shouldn't be done also geographically, that this is Estonian art or this is Latvian art, but this is kind of contemporary art made by an Estonian. And maybe living in Estonia or maybe living in Berlin. But if like most artists lives in Berlin, then you can also, well, kind of like jokingly say that, yeah, it has a sort of Berlin touch or something like that, but it's more of like a context of where the art is made, but not some sort of like a specific art form. So these, anyway, like this idea of nation state, I mean, it is relevant as it still, you know, is part of our everyday lives as well, but I don't see also a long future for that as well. It's, in the end, it's a structure. Because, you know, a culture and a nation are still different things.
Well, I guess, to use pretentious words, contemporary art is very deterritorialized.
Basically, yeah. I mean, there's maybe now there's also going to be some changes because what this pandemic has brought on, it kind of has, you know, pressured a sort of locality back onto this sort of creative sector. That also this kind of cliche of an international artist is that basically he lives in airports, you know, that, you know, and curators and collectors and so on, they have this you know, basically like world tours of going from a fair to a fair to a biennial to a fair to a biennial. This has all kind of stopped. So I don't know what the future in that sense brings. Maybe it brings back sort of locality, but like when maybe before the Berlin Wall we could also speak of, you know, centers and peripheries, then they do still exist, I guess. You still have Berlin, New York, London, so on. But then again, people can't also afford to live there anymore. So, English artists can't afford to live in London. And very few people who live in Berlin. I mean, Berlin you can afford to live because it's cheap. But almost everyone who I know who lives in Berlin doesn't work in Berlin. So that's also from the art sector, it's a good place to live. It's a good hub, but you mainly work internationally, but very rarely
so you live in Berlin, but to have access to London, New York, so on.
Exactly. But there's also like a huge amount of galleries and a huge amount of art institutions in Berlin, and even a huger amount of people. So that's another aspect of this messed up world.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting thing to see, if this sort of Corona crisis and everything will bring back some locality, and maybe we'll get a little bit more national identity or national culture back into art. That's something we'll maybe see.
But I don't think actually that much about maybe the national culture or national identity would come back into art via the sort of national problems that the art starts to deal with, or that the artworks themselves are more, they come or they spring out of local problems, not that much then of international or kind of like center problems, issues that are more relevant in Berlin, but then an artist who is a fan of Berlin is dealing with the same issues in Tallinn, but Tallinn doesn't have those issues, or this sort of thing. That you start more, and as well curators start more looking more towards their neighboring countries as well. That's you start getting these sort of localities of not only in one nation state, but just where you can more easily get to in these Corona times. And then there's the other main trend in contemporary art that I see is basically the focus on climate change, which is kind of also, it's a separate story of a podcast, but this is also definitely something that even institutions need to kind of work around with, because also this sort of a big institution, huge amount of staff, huge amount of spaces that need to be climate controlled, huge storage spaces, preserving for eternity. How do you get all these to be to have a zero footprint, for example, is a question. And from that perspective, also these kind of smaller institutions, I think, have like a head start, because they are more easily. They can more easily adapt or change their entire method of working, for example. So this is maybe also one goal that EKKM has, to kind of work towards that, but that kind of needs initially an investment, for example. But we also have kind of close acquaintance institutions that are also working on that end. But especially in Central Europe and Scandinavia now, the focus of biennials and festivals and as well as individual artists has tilted towards dealing with issues regarding climate change, and not that directly, but this is something that is universally relevant. And maybe it's in a way also an easy way out as well, to find some function for art.
Yeah, well, the one thing is to balance, that dealing with it because it's important, but at the same time, not jumping on it because it's a trend, and also an easy way, to have an idea for an art, it's about climate change.
Yeah, exactly. But then again, it's also this sort of hypocrisy that, from first-hand culture and art has no purpose to see from this sort of capitalist perspective. This is completely kind of useless or wasting potential. And then at the same time, it's also very globalist in that sense that there's a huge amount of pointless traveling, just flying around for one day to see a space that you will have exhibition in 1 year, or just being in a different city every day to see what exhibitions are on, and then traveling around, or this sort of thing. That thankfully Corona has kind of stopped that, and people have understood that okay, this meeting could have also been an email, or this kind of scaling down on things, because I guess this sort of facade play and kind of representational play of what the commercial aspect has brought in to the art sector, this mainly in the commercial gallery sector, but also with bigger institutions that deal with private funding. You have this catering towards private money, and having this facade of success as well, and of fame, and what's the other main word that I'm currently not remembering. Basically, like
success, fame.
Like an impression of success in that sense. You have this fa-fa.
Appraise,
basically.
I guess. Critical success, maybe.
But no, you're looking for a more banal word that's more to do with having fancy dresses and cocktail parties and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. Basically, it's still like being this kind of bourgeois, almost like having I don't know, this very, very rich lifestyle in that sense, but basically just mimicking it in the exhibition opening context, for example, or otherwise you're a broke artist.
You can't pay your rent, but you're in a fancy suit drinking champagne at the exhibition.
Exactly. So this sort of champagne socialism was also kind of a shadow in the art context as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think this has been a very interesting conversation. We covered a lot of topics, and thank you for being available. And
thank you for inviting.